The material that I'm going to be talking about today, some of it's also drawn from this book, which is due out, I think, on Amazon and Barnes & Noble on the 26th of this month, called City Folk. And it's about, it's subtitled as English Country Dance and the Politics of the Folk in Modern America. So it's about the folk revivals in New York City in the progressive period in particular, but also the folk revival and the role of Greenwich Village and Washington Square Park plays a part in the story as well in later chapters. So for those of you who want to get my take on some of those things, you're invited to do so. I sent you all an email inadvertently because it told me that it wasn't sending it out. It went out many times, but for which I apologize. So you all got 4 emails with the same text, I fear. I got them as well. Just to let you know that those of you participating in Game 3 on the East Village, hand those in on Monday, and I'll give out the prize on Wednesday. Can I ask those of you playing with technology to cease playing with technology? Or I will take the technology. We will have a prize for the East Village. Okay. Please, thank you. Some of you may recall that when we talked about work in the 18th century, we talked about how people, if they were making or selling shoes, often traveled around the countryside. They were artisans, and in walking around, they were called tramping artisans. In the 1870s, with the midst of a Great Depression, people went around looking for work, and they become stigmatized now as tramps. And what had earlier been a form of dignity for the kind of, that was descriptive of the kind of work that people did or how people went about trying to do their work, now becomes a source of concern in cities across the country, which passed laws against these people called Vagrancy Laws. We live with them today. Their origins are from the first Great Industrial Depression in the United States in the 1870s. John Dos Passos writes a novel about the United States, a trilogy in 3 parts called USA. It takes in the 20s, but it takes place in the teens and in New York City. A good part of it does. One volume is called The Big Money. And in that volume, a character, one of the lead characters, a woman and some of her friends, are organizing and agitating in Greenwich Village on behalf, trying to describe the conditions of what they think of as exploitation of workers that had led to the conditions in the garment industry, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, for instance. They are jailed because of these new free speech laws that are put up, which make them subject to arrest for supposedly inciting revolution. They're sent off to jail, where they infuriate everyone even more by singing songs. The songs they sing, however, are songs both of solidarity and songs that mean to express what they believe to be, with revolutionary ardor, the concerns and problems of the working class in the cities, songs that will be inherited in the 30s and in the civil rights movement, labor movements and peace movements of the 60s and 70s, and some of those songs will be picked up by conservative activists as well. So We Shall Not Be Moved is a song that ends up being used by left, right, and center when they engage in social protest in the late 20th century. Many of those songs, some of which they, by the way, in turn have borrowed from black spirituals, have their origins in books that are published every year by a radical group called the Industrial Workers of the World, called the Little Red Songbook. And in these songs they sing, the Little Red Songbook had a subtitle, Songs of the Workers to Fan the Flames of Discontent. So the songs were meant to be songs that you would sing to help to build solidarity against what they saw as oppressive conditions. They would sing songs like, Hallelujah, I'm a bum. So in fact, they would try to invert the narrative about what it meant to be a hobo or what it meant to be a tramp, because in fact they celebrated themselves They would say, we're hobos, we get on the trains and ride from city to city, get off so that we can do organizing. We don't have big financial backers. We don't have the money to decide to ride first class. We don't have frequent flyer mileage. Their alternative was to hop onto the boxcars and the trains. So they would then sing songs that would invert all the new kind of bourgeois values. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum today. Hallelujah, give me a handout and revive me again. Those kinds of songs they would sing, and they would just agitate and anger their jailers, even as they sought to build solidarity. The preamble from the Little Red Songbook, however, also reprinted the preamble to the Industrial Workers of the World, an organization that had enormous support within Greenwich Village, where we were last time in our lecture in talking about the creation of a cosmopolitan, radical political space, an alternative culture. I read briefly from that preamble to give you a sense that their message was, in fact, quite threatening to some of the new rising industrial capitalists. It began, "The working class and the employing class have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among millions of the working people, and the few who make up the employing class have all the good things of life. Between these two classes, a struggle must go on until the workers of the world organize as a class, take possession of the means of production, abolish the wage system, and live in harmony on the earth." Now, some parts of that message are not terribly different than the preamble that we heard to the new Trades Association in 1834, the division, creation of a class, the privileging of the few against the many, conditions of vassalage. But now they're standing up in large numbers, and they have the support of many people who have been out on the streets in large numbers in protest. In addition, they're suggesting that rather than the presumption that there can be, in fact, harmony between the classes, that they actually have nothing in common until the conditions of destitution are removed, and that will resemble what they were calling a class struggle. It didn't take much for this group that historians conventionally will call a middle class. I find that term a little too broad. But certainly this new white-collar labor force and the bankers, financiers, managers, all in support of the new industrial machine, found this very threatening. People recognized that language about class struggle came from places like Karl Marx. It was easy for them to imagine it as a foreign ideology. And indeed, it was part of an ideology that had national traction. The preamble ends just with the following. Instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, that was the AFL's motto, the motto of the American Federation of Labor, that was in fact thought to be trying to simply get a fair piece of the pie so that they could share the pie with the ruling class. They weren't arguing, in fact, that there was a struggle that was inevitable that would go on. They were arguing it was possible to have peace between the two. The IWW was saying instead of the conservative model, a fair day's work for a fair day's work, we must inscribe on our banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wage system. It is the historic mission of the working class to do away with capitalism. The army of production must be organized not only for everyday struggle with capitalists, but to carry on production when capitalism shall have been overthrown. By organizing industrially, we're forming the structure of the new society within the shell of the old. And indeed, their radical organization for the abolition of the wage system, not arguing for a higher wage, not saying, oh, we're willing to have 72 cents more over a month's pay. They're saying that won't do because they'll just increase prices. We have to abolish the wage system, which is based on the extraction of profit from our labor. That's the argument that they're making. That was a much more revolutionary and threatening proposition. Okay. I'll read you just one little other piece that was in this book, in the songbook every year, because some of you might find it amusing. It's by Jack London, the writer, who was a member of the IWW. He wrote a little story called "What is a Scab?" He writes simply, "After God had finished the rattlesnake, the toad, and the vampire, he had some awful substance left with which he made a scab. A scab is a two-legged animal with a corkscrew soul and a water brain, a combination backbone of jelly and glue. Where others have hearts, he carries the tumor of rotten principles. When a scab comes down the street, men turn their backs and angels weep in heaven, and the devil shuts the gates of hell to keep him out. No man or woman has a right to scab so long as there is a pool of water to drown the carcass in, or a rope long enough to hang his body with." Judas was a gentleman compared with a scab. A scab, by the way, everyone know what a scab is? It's a non-union worker. Okay? It's a non-union worker. Judas was a gentleman compared with a scab. For betraying his master, he had character enough to hang himself. A scab has not. Esau sold his birthright for a mess of pottage. Judas sold his Savior for 30 pieces of silver. Benedict Arnold sold his country for a promise of a commission in the British Army. The scab sells his birthright, country, his wife, his children, and his fellow man to unfulfilled promises from his employer. Esau was a traitor to himself. Judas was a traitor to his God. Benedict Arnold was a traitor to his country. A scab is a traitor to his God, his country, his family, and his class. There is nothing lower than a scab. Reformers sought to ask, is there an alternative to the IWW? How do we get workers to think about more rationally about progress, which is, after all, in their minds, tied to wealth and to people who are industrious, not simply complainers. And they try to format a series of alternative strategies that, on the one hand, we suggested before, could be the stick, in which case you simply jail them and beat them down, or bring in Pinkertons, or a carrot, in which you try to encourage and induce them to understand that there is a better way, a set of alternatives to class struggle. Reformers sought, in that sense, a more moderate, what they believed not foreign but American response to the problems that they could acknowledge of poverty. They sometimes believed that poverty, as we've suggested, was simply laziness or conditions of the dangerous classes. But in other cases, they understood poverty was tied to bad environments. They sought an alternative to radical economic restructuring that was being proposed by this radical group in the village. The problem, as they understood it, could be seen both in political alternatives and in cultural or social alternatives, and they saw them as related to one another. They looked around them and they saw cultural dissolution that was enticing this working class into bad behavior. Nightclubs in the urban metropolis epitomized the liminal moral and social spaces of decadent New York. In New York, the Follies of 1907 inaugurated revues, 21 of them all over the country in the next decade. They were produced by Florence Ziegfeld, along the lines of the Folies Bergère in Paris, which any true blue American knew to be the center of decadence, Bohemian Paris. Ziegfeld's Follies displayed Parisian cosmopolitan wickedness and scantily clad svelte women parading on the stage. If that wasn't dangerous enough in teaching bad behavior, dance crazes in the nightclubs were equally bad. They were not simply performance clubs, but places where one could go and participate. And they took hold of New York City between 1911 and 1916 in what were thought to be scandalous bodily expressions that worried respectable New York. They were initiated in 1911 and 1914 by the worst of all those possible dances, the tango. The tango craze had come up from Argentina, swept through London and New York in the second decade. It brought people into intimate bodily behavior that enticed them to lose their good sense of propriety. On top of the tango were a host of new animal dances that encouraged people to behave like animals rather than as superior human beings. Notably, the cakewalk from 1915, the black bottom, and then animal dances like the foxtrot and the Charleston. The craze borrowed from African American dance, not from more formal European steps. And ragtime, some of which you heard earlier, stimulated a lot of new dances as Irving Berlin popularized the music with the publication of Alexander's Ragtime Band in 1911. The major emphasis of these new dances was not steps, it was rhythm, gyrating, sexual enticement, the one step in 1911, moving the body to music, followed by the turkey trot, the crab, the Texas tummy, the grizzly bear, the lame duck, the monkey, the camel walk. You can hear all the animal names. Beyond those, ball in the jack, the funky butt, the bunny hug, walk the dog, the chicken scratch, the Gabby glide, and that simple two-step, the snake dip. The new cabarets were the dance halls of the city. Kathy Pice gives you some familiarity with them. They removed the boundaries of the theater and encouraged the audience to participate. The dance floor becomes a kind of staging area in the cabarets, and they sprung up overnight in the city. By accounts, by 1910, there were over 500 dance halls in New York City. There were another 100 dance academies encouraging people to learn how to gyrate to this wild music. As important as the wildness of the music was the character of the space itself. It was unchaperoned. Women were there at risk. Alcohol was served, and liberally. And it added to the breakdown of inhibitions, it was thought. It led to fears about intimacy and loss of control that would lead people to riotous behavior, to what we might call the lack of right thinking, right-minded thinking, not right-wing, although that may have been what it meant to be, but right thinking, proper thinking. Respectable behavior is the key. What people who self-identify themselves as respectable New York argue is respectable behavior, behave like me. Kathy Pice refers to this music, to this dancing, the worst form of this dancing, as spieling. And it was wild, pivoting dancing in which people lost control. This is my partner, Elizabeth Friedman. The dance we believe they were doing was called the Zwiefacher, and it alternated pivoting steps and waltz steps and created a kind of intimacy that scandalized New York.
Schneider singt's once, geht's weiter, weiter singt's Taschens Jörg. Schneider singt's once, geht's weiter, weiter singt's Taschens Jörg. Biegen, 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 mach Jörg. Schneider, und gegen Bienen macht Blatt. Schneider, Schneider, sieht das Jahr.
Whoa. Thank you, Elizabeth. So you can see that if you're pivoting with someone, you have to actually have a lot of intimacy, because if you're going to get around, you have to have your leg between each other. In Scandinavian dancing, what do they call it?
Respect, where you
No, when
between
yeah, but what do they call it when your leg's against the other person's leg?
thigh to thigh.
Thigh to thigh, basically, you dance. So you can imagine why respectable New York might worry about such dancing. So what was to be done to counter political and moral degeneracy? Some focus on the environment as a cause, the slum, the dissolute family, and most notably, bad housing conditions, and they focus on reform of housing. Early housing reform began with tenement house laws as early as 1869. These early laws had very low standards. The objective was, in fact, to facilitate building the housing as easily as possible. There were some fire escapes, and there was ventilation or a window for any interior room had to be connected to a room that had a window. So the interior rooms didn't have to have a window, but they had to be connected to a room that had a window. So on the whole, it was the front room of the house had a window, and the back room of the house had a window, and you could have two rooms in between connected to other. They led to a railway flat design, okay, long and narrow. Even these modest laws were poorly enforced. They did, however, begin to symbolize as early as 1867 the idea that communities had a right to a standard about housing. And in 1879, that standard was raised with the creation of what was known as a dumbbell tenement. Those of you who went with me on the Chelsea tour, we saw a dumbbell tenement. I unfortunately can't show you the picture of the dumbbell tenement today, but all of you can imagine what a dumbbell looks like, not your neighbor, but rather the kind of thing that you would see in a gym. It has two wide ends and a narrow part in the middle. So if you take an initial, let's see if we can find a way to do this. If you take your buildings, normally they're just next to one another. There's no room. So any of these rooms here are simply positioned next to the other rooms. You can't see it in the back. Just two blocks next to one another. There's no room between. Once you create a dumbbell, you create an interior space so that when the two buildings are against one another, there's a setback of a couple of feet in the middle, which allows a window to be placed. So in the interior would now have a window. It'll be looking out on the window of the building next to it. Those buildings will be perhaps 6 feet apart. They're still adjoining one another at each end, but in the middle they've bowed out, leaving the space. Is this clear enough to you? The danger from that situation was only that if you threw garbage down, it went to the bottom of the chute and created a chimney effect. So it was a fire hazard, but did allow you to have interior rooms with a few windows, with a window in them, okay? That's the dumbbell tenement as it was created. The alternative, the third alternative to this kind of proposition was known as investment philanthropy. It was led by a Brooklyn housing reformer by the name of Alfred T. White, and it informed a lot of the buildings of the late 19th century. And it was the notion simply that buildings that were put up had to be profitable and had to encourage people, the poor, not to be dependent on charity by encouraging them to pay rent. That rent was morally important because it encouraged people to save money and get used to paying for what they receive, paying for services. So it was an effort, as it were, to argue that the building of housing was a way of encouraging a pattern of life, encouraging participation in a for-profit system. In New York City, the popular imaginary about poverty was informed by the photos of one of the major reformers, a Danish newspaperman in New York City by Danish born named Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S. Many of you know of Riis's photos. Many of them were published in the Evening Sun, the local New York newspaper, and they argued for better housing, for adequate lighting and sanitation, and for the construction of city parks and neighborhoods near the houses. He portrayed, on the whole, the middle class and upper class citizens as benefactors, and then urged them to take an active role in creating this better housing, in defining and shaping what these communities would be like. Riis believed that charitable citizens would help the poor when they saw how what he called the other half lived, and that's what the title of his book was, How the Other Half Lives. So his intention was to document those conditions. We know that his fame as a photographer and reformer stimulated concern for the poor. He gave views of poverty, of chaos, and of crowding. We also know that he constructed most of those photographs. That's to say, he had people pose. He chose, photographs are documents, but they are constructed documents. That's to say, you decide who to look at, but we don't see what's outside the frame. So sometimes we take photos of things that we think are interesting to people, and they tend to be the more dramatic rather than the more prosaic things, because we don't think that they will sell in a newspaper or more be engaging to a public. So more recent research has documented how much Riis's photos were in fact constructed documents to elicit a very particular notion that people ought to have sympathy with the poor because the poor were dissolute. So in fact, his attitudes were quite patronizing, but meant to be helpful from his perspective. He was what we would argue now that reform was effectively conservative. Again, he wasn't supporting any systematic change, any systemic change in the conditions. He didn't focus on jobs that might allow them to have enough money to pay for rent. He wasn't looking at the sources of employment or unemployment. He wasn't looking at patterns of discrimination. He was focusing on the house itself that would make a better citizen. Okay? And he dwelt on stereotypes. He had stock stereotypes of Jews, which he referred to them. For them, money is God. And he didn't see them as having bonds of faith or loyalty. He saw the Irish as all engaged in politics and drink, and as happy-go-lucky people who like to live like pigs in a pigsty. So his attitudes, in many respects, helped to advance new kinds of social action, but they're rooted actually in older 19th century attitudes about what we might call conservative liberalism, the liberalism based in free markets and based in notions of reform. Little faith in government, and believes that it was the wealthy and not the state who ought to be interventionist. Okay? That's to say, he's believing that people should be helped, but it's a very individualist philosophy, self-help. Help them learn how to help themselves. Nonetheless, he's trying to create conditions that he feels will make them more respectable and provide alternatives to believing that benefactors are just their enemy. Rather, the benefactors he's suggesting and trying to give them a role as helpmates to the poor, rather than class antagonists. Riis renewed an intense focus on housing. It was a housing interest that had already come from earlier efforts in planning that occur around the same time, that had been stimulated by the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, the fair that was known about the White City. And some of you who again went on tour with me may recall, we talked a little bit about the White City at the Siegel Cooper building in the Ladies' Mile, a building, the department store, the largest and grandest of the department stores. It was in Game 1, Fragment 1, as you may recall, or early fragments in Game 1. The Siegel Cooper department store is a white building. It was built by two department store magnates from Chicago, and it was meant, again, to create a modern space for people to behave as modern citizens. People for whom being a modern person was, in fact, to celebrate the consumer self. To go in and buy and reshape your identity in terms of a new consumer identity. The White City becomes a model. It becomes a model for the creation of what was called generally a city beautiful movement at the turn of the century. New Greek Revival architecture, street signage, public art, and monumental buildings, all of which, again, are meant to encourage people that they're living in a beautiful space and their behavior should reflect the grandness of that space. Architecture is often used, as we know, as meant to encourage forms of social behavior. And the City Beautiful movement tries to do that. It tries to do it even more so by creating new communities that can shape behavior. Garden cities. The Garden City movement, again, develops at the end of the 19th century under the work of a man named Ebenezer Howard for garden suburbs. Some of those garden suburbs are in New York City. One of the most fundamental ones that some of you know is called Forest Hills in Queens. Sunnyside in Queens is another garden suburb. You can go back and see those suburbs today and see how they try to use the creation of a rural anti-urban space as suggesting how fresh air and private space can help change behavior and create a different kind of urban citizen. Reese also stimulated urban housing reforms. A tenement house commission in 1894 focused on health and city baths. We'd always heard that godliness was next to cleanliness, or is it cleanliness is next to godliness? In any case, a bath can cleanse the soul, was the assumption. And we may think of it as a cliche, but it actually took place in social policy with the development of city baths, some of which were the one source for immigrant communities, in fact, to get clean. The bathhouse that you would see, for instance, on East 10th Street is an example of that. The Schwitz, as it would be used within the Jewish community, has some of its origins and support from that.
Were they public? Like, could anyone?
Public, yes.
You didn't have to pay a fee or anything?
On modest fee in some cases for towels, but quite modest, but something people could afford. For other reformers, the problems extended beyond the house. They extended, you could build a clean house, but you still had to deal with what went on inside that house. The concerns then extend to the working class family itself. Not just the factory, not just the housing, but what's to happen with children. How are children to be reformed? Now again, remember, this is an old concern. We saw it in the trains that were taking people out of New York City, the orphan trains. Done in London, it's done, by the way, in Australia, and it's done in the United States, in which the new charity organization societies are shipping working class children out into rural settlements where supposedly white Anglo-Saxon farm stock can help to cultivate their minds, not just the land in which these people live. So it's not simply an old idea. Now, however, what can you do with the children who are still here? And one alternative was, in fact, to think about the schools and to think about what could happen in the schools, educational reform. To get the kids outside the working class family, they celebrate kindergartens, we talked about last time. The origins come from William Froebel in Germany in the 1840s, picked up by a St. Louis businessman, a daughter of a St. Louis businessman, a woman named Susan Blau in St. Louis, is influenced by Froebel and starts the first kindergarten in New York City in 1873. The objective, again, is to push back education, to get kids at an early age before the parents can ruin them. The movement, therefore, was designed from twin impulses. One were the conditions of the working class environment. Housing and street life was seen as dangerous. And the second was a new stimulus, the rise of something, a science of childhood, the rise of child psychology, especially from the work of G. Stanley Hall, the Clark University professor instrumental with the development of psychology as a discipline. Clark decides that, in fact, things have to happen in the school for children and for the ways in which children learn, most especially the earliest forms of learning, which we call play. And he focuses on how children will learn to play in the earliest years. And he argues it had to be less militaristic, like gymnastics, which was in the German tradition, and it had to emphasize something he now called democratic group play, which would teach kids how to behave like Americans, democratic Americans. He calls for productive play and recreation, scientifically managed. Some of this stimulates new groups that have their place in New York City. You'll see some of them, boys' clubs and girls' clubs. The origins of these, of course, begin in 1911 with the American Boy Scouts, which are deliberate efforts to create what they call muscular Christianity through rural revitalization. By emulating in the Boy Scouts, rural crafts could be learned from the backwoods people, could be brought to urban people, and hopefully revitalize themselves with the purity that comes from rural areas that hasn't been tainted by wicked city life and all those dance halls and all that intimacy and wild turning. Juliet Gordon Low meets Baden Powell, who starts the Boy Scouts in 1911, and she starts the Girl Guides, which are the equivalent for girls. And they are quite insistent that the girls have to be kept separate from the boys. Okay? So you have Girl Guides and you have Boy Scouts. Girls, they understand, have to also learn a form of Christianity, but a form of domestic Christianity. Again, however, from the guides, using these more, learning how to sew, learning the domestic crafts, making your own clothing, etc. In the cities, beyond those, is a playground movement. In New York, it's led by a man named Luther Gulick, G-U-L-I-C-K, who as early as 1912 formed something called the Campfire Girls in Vermont, and then brings that impulse back to New York City. All of those kinds of organizations, New York Campfire Girls, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Guides, were all meant to be engaged in forms of what they called productive play, based on craft traditions drawn from the virtues of pioneer life. Now, these groups, it should be noted, are also integral at the moment, to a larger project in the United States tied to American colonialism and imperialism. So this is at the very same time that these groups, and by the way, Tarzan becomes popular at that time as well. He's part of that kind of imagining about the ways in which frontier he-men can be made. He's, after all, a civilized gentleman in England this is his origins, the civilized gentleman in England who goes there and then meets his Jane. And in the wilderness and in safe places, they have this kind of masculinity that is both pure and revitalizing. That same moment is when the United States, Germany, France, these Western powers are all becoming new colonial empires in Africa and in Asia. Remember, in the United States, it'll become the Philippines, it'll become Cuba. And the justification all becomes that these little black and brown people are Catholic, and we need to go in there with our Protestant culture and civilize. And it's all fed by this kind of common ideology. In its own way, the Lower East Side is a colony that has to be civilized. It's a form of domestic colonization that's going on in New York City that's parallel to what's going on in the national and international sphere. And it's being mobilized by a new group of experts, expert reformers, what would be called good neighbors. These experts are, in fact, the new white-collar professionals. all who now have licenses to make them professional. They're all certified. They get the state, which they otherwise don't want to have anything to do with, to certify them so that they can control admission to their profession and not allow too much competition to come in to undermine their status. So these organizations all become interested in professionalizing and in certification as a way of controlling the size of their labor force, because if you can keep it small, you can maintain power, and you can keep out competition, and you can raise your wage. So the new professions, all of which are largely based in New York City, national organizations are all based in New York, are the teachers' unions. The doctors, the same ones who now as professionals will be inspecting all the immigrants on Ellis Island and elsewhere. The new police surveillance specialists. They will lead to the FBI and groups like that, specialists in crime control. Social workers are no longer to be Lady Bountifuls. Now they're to be something new called professional social workers, having an expertise which they're going to call casework. It basically was interviewing people and telling them where to find, the local TB clinic. But they claim it as expertise and knowledge base that they can use, and they later harness a new form of expertise. It'll be called Freudianism, as something that they can use as a scientific base. So we have all of these new groups to basically patrol the boundaries of class, to determine who is deserving, who is undeserving, and to administer reform from a position of privilege because they are experts. Okay? Because they argue an expert knowledge base. In fact, the Charity Organization Society, which leads many of these efforts, does provide what they believed a normal standard of living. And they would provide support, but they would determine what was a standard of living, and their form of help to people was to go among immigrants and conduct budget studies and teach people how to budget, how to save for a rainy day, as a way of both teaching thrift, that's to say moral values, and teaching people how to survive because you've saved enough money. Not doing an analysis of jobs or wages, but rather suggesting that the real answer to poverty is saving money, okay, and budgeting properly. The new experts, of course, were these caseworkers, are efficiency experts in that sense, not unlike Frederick Winslow Taylor, and remember the lessons from all of your favorite Schmidt the pig iron handler. Okay? Efficiency experts, in other words. And efficiency is what budget studies are about, teaching people how to be efficient with limited resources. One set of experts in the cities as part of the new progressive movement are, of course, city managers and planners. And New York City begins to establish zoning laws as early as 1916. Though, again, understand that the motive and support for this came as much from wealthy people who didn't want to live in the shadow of big buildings. So a 42-story building had gone up, the Equitable Building in 1915, and it had cast a shadow 7 blocks long, time of the day. So everybody who lived in that shadow now had an incentive to want zoning laws passed, because it was presumed that zoning was a way that affected the quality of life. Of course, the issue was what gets zoned for what, and it becomes a very important political weapon and point of contestation for our history. On the whole, zoning becomes largely a tool of private interests, whether it was to be real estate developers, and only in the post-1960 era does it become equally a tool of community activists trying to fight these interests by claiming, using planning laws, that they can have something called an historic district to contain building. So until the late 60s and the early 70s, on the whole, most of these laws are used by private interests, and by and large never are involved in what we would call a social policy. The focus on children's bodies focuses on 2 areas, settlements and playgrounds. The first of these, of course, is the settlement house movement, of which New York pioneers with the largest number. The settlement house movement is an English invention that's brought over to the United States. There's a lot of movement. These, after all, many of the wealthiest people here were of English origin. There was a lot of exchange. So a lot of what we're talking about is truly Anglo-American or transatlantic. The Toynbee Hall was established in 1884 in England by Samuel Bennett, the canon of St. Jude's Church in the Whitechapel district of London's East End. That's to say, the origins of these movements were among religious activists concerned with Christian mission to the poor, and they are projects for the poor. The East End was the equivalent to our East Side. Its origins reflect, therefore, the combination of Christian and, in some ways, socialist missions to the poor, to help the poor. And it characterized a lot of transatlantic progressive era reform. In some, the socialism largely falls out and it becomes what we would call kind of conservative social reform rather than socialist reform. You'll see that in terms of the kinds of what happens in settlement houses. The first settlement in this area comes from the leader of a new movement called Ethical Culture, New York, Stanton Coit, C-O-I-T, who visits Toynbee Hall in 1886 and opens the first of America's settlements, the Neighborhood Guild on the Lower East Side in 1887. After 1900, in the next 2 decades, in the United States, there were more than 100 settlements in the first decade, and after 1910, more than 400 of them. Most of the settlements are modeled on the Charity Organization Society, an organization that went back to the 1840s that we've talked about. These were the folks who largely were conservative reformers who were mostly concerned with the dangerous classes and alleviating the dangerous classes. They focus on self-help. They focus on Christianizing the poor as a way of Americanizing them. Many of the most famous, especially in New York City, however, and especially in Greenwich Village, have a much clearer social mission that is inspired by the socialist politics that are on the street, in the air in Greenwich Village. Lillian Wald founds the Henry Street settlement, and she will be the person who is most instrumental in the development of a visiting nurse association coming out of the settlements. The whole idea that there should be specialists and people who will go out and learn to serve the community. And remember, we mentioned that there were visiting nurses active in the Harlem community in the 1920s. They come out of Lillian Wald's movement, a woman who was a member and active participant in the Socialist Party and part of this new bohemia in New York City. Mary Simkovich founds Greenwich House, also around the corner from here. A pioneer in public health and public housing reform, again with her husband, socialist activists. All of these people sought to teach immigrants how to adjust, how to survive better by combining skills in language and budgets with skills on interclass dialogue and cooperation as the basis for democracy. In that sense, they are not, in fact, taking the position, these are not industrial workers of the world organizers. They're not arguing that there is a class conflict that doesn't allow people to cross these class boundaries. They're arguing it's possible to create a cooperative ethos, an ethic. And the settlement house is a place where, in fact, middle class and elite reformers can work cooperatively with working class people, and where working class people can be taught how to be cooperative, how to be democratic. Now, in truth, that may have been how these reformers intended the space to be used. That's not only always clear that that's how people use the space. many of us write books all the time and then complain when we get a review and we say, but that's not the book I wrote. That's to say, you can't control the lessons that people take out of messages. Okay? You can decide that you want to say one set of things, but people can take very different things out of them. So the Settlement House reformers wanted a certain kind of messages to come out. They could sometimes lead to people organizing more radically or less, and be less cooperative than they presume. But their objective is to build cooperation. They do so by arguing that the cooperative was to be the schoolyard and playground as sites for cooperative play. And they begin the development of what's called the playground movement. Boston opens the first playground. It's simply 3 piles of sand at a children's mission in 1885. New York City opens 31 supervised playgrounds between 1899 and 1906, when Luther Gulick, the man I mentioned to you before, takes this new movement and organizes it into a national association called the Playground Association of America, based in New York City. The honorary president is a man who is known for the ways in which he values the pioneer life. A man who had been involved, as you may recall, as a conservative candidate in the defeat of Henry George. Now the president, Teddy Roosevelt, the origins of the teddy bear. He's made honorary president. The muckraking reformer, Jacob Riis, is made honorary vice president. Gulick is in fact the president. And the group moves to enact legislation in New York State mandating something all of you have benefited from, or at least experienced. That's to say, minimum requirements for school recess and something new, a whole new form of education, physical education. The idea that the body needs to be educated, preferably to be a respectable body. Schools, by the way, of education emerge, and at their origins, they teach physical education. And their concern is the ways in which the body is to be educated. It wouldn't surprise you that one of the things they teach, therefore, is dance. It doesn't take place. That's why we have a dance program at the Steinhardt School, not just at Tisch. Because its origins well precede dance programs at art schools. They initially begin rather in teachers' colleges as forms of education for the young. This was to be both a gendered and an imperial project. Gulick, who was a medical doctor by profession, believed that the modern city produced what he called ease, mushiness, and softness in the world. They thought it produced mushy politics and soft politics. What they wanted was a masculine set of politics. Boys, he argued, had, quote, been made lax, and they needed to be made strong and manly by being taught boxing and football. To quote him, if there ever was the need for a stiff-backed boy, it is in the modern city. Thus, in 1903, Gulick founded the New York Public School Athletic League. And he becomes the first director of physical training. Again, their notion of training boys is to teach them how to fight. That good, strong, and real boys, men, will know how to stand up for themselves, know how to fight, and be good soldiers of the state. Girls, Gulick realized they were the real problem. Because if the state was to recapitulate itself, girls had to be able to provide us new boys, and girls who could provide yet more new boys. So girls were the real moral issue, because they're the ones most vulnerable in this decadence as a group that needs to be protected. Not surprisingly, the new forms of legislation against, remember the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, was called protective legislation. It was legislation for girls, for women, and children, not for men in the factories. It presumes men have to learn to stand up for themselves, women and children have to be protected. Okay. He believed that schools already had some physical education for boys. He wrote, quote, "Girls are, from every point of view, the girls are our great national problem." Man's work had become subject to mechanization, but not girls. Girls tend, he argued, to sit about and gossip or play jackstraws. If no provision is made for them, quote, "Vigorous health and a good physique are always among the chief charms of women, and childbirth has become more difficult with each succeeding generation. The result for women," he warned, "was greater sterility, dread of childbirth, less ability to nurse babies, and the answer," again quoting from, "the school and the community need to put very much greater emphasis on play and physical activity for girls, especially during the period before puberty." So he believed the great problem of our generation was that all this wild dancing threatened girls' reproductive organs. He also, by the way, believed that higher education threatened your reproductive organs as well. I don't have the evidence for that. I don't know what his evidence for that was. But again, this was a very influential person writing at the turn of the century. This is the world we lived in.
Because educated women had fewer babies?
They indeed did, which just proves that may have been some of the evidence. Indeed, nowadays virtually everybody has, but indeed they even then had, middle class had fewer babies than working class people. Gulick's answer was to create the girls' branch of the public school athletic league. It gets founded by a woman named Jessie Bancroft in 1905 with the support of two prominent New York City women that you've heard about before, one of whom you've heard about, Grace Dodge. She's one of these grand dames from the new radical reformer movements that are forming alliances with the women from the Women's Trade Union League with working class women. And the other is a woman named Ellen Speyer, S-P-E-Y-E-R. The Dodge, by the way, will be part of the Dodge family. These are elite women, and they turn over the leadership to a musician in New York City, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Burchenal, B-U-R-C-H-E-N-A-L, B-U-R-C-H-E-N-A-L, a woman who pioneers the American folk dance movement. Obviously, you can learn more about her in my book. Burchenal, however, leads alternative forms of bodily expressions that would not injure women's reproductive organs, arguing that the folk revival would be a response to urban industrialization. The folk revival is what the Boy Scouts were about. The folk revival was what was the arts and crafts movement at the time was all about, that designed new furniture during this period. It also was the new forms of exercise that were to take place in settlement houses and playgrounds as alternatives to dance halls, because in the settlement and on the playgrounds they would be chaperoned, and there would be no alcohol, and they would be respectable forms of embodiment. These were to be the new folk dances. Burchenal pointedly establishes the connection between folk dance, democracy, and Americanization. She writes, "Folk dances have universal appeal as an innocent, wholesome, happy form of relaxation and social enjoyment. They emphasize the large opportunities as, and this is her words, a democratic socializing agent, and its value as a form of real Americanization, because they teach all folks how, and I'm using her words, to develop citizenship in a friendly and democratic way. This," she argues, "would be real Americanization." Jane Addams, some of you have heard of, who is a pioneer in the settlement house movement, in her own 1909 book, Spirit of Youth in the City Streets, understood this. She writes, "These old forms of dancing, which have been worked out in many lands and through long experiences, safeguard unwary and dangerous expression, and yet afford a vehicle through which a gaiety of youth may flow. Their forms are indeed those which lie at the basis of good breeding, forms which at once express and restrain, urge forward and set limits. The result, both in England, in London, and in New York, is the passage of laws in city after city mandating that American or English folk songs and folk dances be taught as a mandatory part of the school curriculum, and that they be offered as a form of recreation and physical education. Indeed, through the middle and latter part of the 20th century, public school education in New York provided, and elsewhere, folk dancing as one of the preferred girls' forms of entertainment. And that was a legacy from this opening decade of the 20th century to teach girls how to have respectable bodies. Folk dancing has been taught in schools ever since, much as it was being taught in the high schools and colleges there in May Day events. Not May Day, the radical holiday, but the celebration of the Maypole. The second folk dance festival from Manhattan in the Bronx took place in 1900 and found 2,500 girls dancing the Maypole dance in Van Cortlandt Park on May 29th. New York City Central Park boasted equally impressive numbers every year up to World War I, and at virtually every girls' school in the country, public universities where girls and boys were present, and girls' schools like Vassar, Simmons, etc., all had these May Day events for the young girls to be out in their gay frocks and dance around the Maypole. 15,000 spectators would join them, and the event would conclude with the girls singing the Star-Spangled Banner and cheering Miss Burchinell. These would be respectable bodies, and one of the ways in which this dancing was respectable, a single hand turn, as intimate as we get, is that we look at each other, and that's about it. It contrasts with the scandalous waltz or the pivot steps, which we cling to one another. Thank you, Elizabeth, again. You can see that's a respectable, thank you, Elizabeth, an respectable, upright body. It was meant to teach what the revivalists called gay simplicity, but it was meant to teach and create an atmosphere that was chaperoned and respectable, and not injure her reproductive organs. I hope I didn't, Elizabeth. Okay. New York City reform takes particularly a left liberal formation that would make New York City the or one of the beacons of liberalism in the United States, and make it seem more cosmopolitan and European in social policy than elsewhere, both to Europeans and to Middle America. And through most of the 20th century, New York City would be seen as a place apart from the rest of the country. It was one of the things that was amazing to think that somehow that the attack on 9/11 was an attack on America. It was an attack on New York, which for most of our history was thought not to be like America by everybody outside of New York. And indeed, even New York, if you remember that New Yorker cartoon from Lecture 1, thought of the rest of the country as not quite New York either. So there are kind of ironies. And indeed, there is a logic to it. That's to say, New York was different. It was different in Greenwich Village, in having a Greenwich Village. It was different in having a Greenwich Village with a Wall Street. There are lots of differences in it. But in terms of social policy, around what our politicians in the decade in which you were coming of age called the L word, liberalism was associated in particular with New York City and with the Village. In New York City, an alternative arises with the rise of these liberal reformers committed to a more activist role for the state than we'd seen before. They're often a conservative element to them. They are an alternative to the IWW. But they will feed into more radical politics because they will begin to argue that the state has a role to play, and they begin to challenge the notion and broaden the notion of what constitute entitlements, a word that we will focus on over the next couple of lectures. It creates a unique place, the unique role of New York Bohemia. They're the precursors of a neoconservative, what the neoconservative op-ed columnist David Brooks called the Bobos, the bourgeois bohemians, Mabel Dodge, Mary Simkovich, Lillian Wall, and people like that. But they are a socially, intellectually powerful community that celebrated an alternative political culture and set of values. A community with working class sympathies, yet from an elite perspective. The result were programs that elaborated the origins of the welfare state in something called a liberal state, something that was not a socialist state, but was what would be called welfare capitalism, that still made New York different than other places in its form of welfare capitalism. It would have some parallels elsewhere, Milwaukee and Schenectady, but would have its greatest elaboration, New York City, in pioneering, as New York would, the New Deal welfare state. That's the story of the next moment, which will be the making of the Socialist Republic of New York City in the 1930s, for which I ask you to tune in on Monday.